28 years old, secret owner of a global hotel empire, worth $5.2 billion, clearing away half-eaten shrimp and cigarette butts. For 4 months she endured the insults of a Mafia Queen, who treated her like dirt, until that woman invited her to a high-stakes gala as a cruel joke. She had no idea she just invited her boss. Zariah stood in the corner of the Grand Imperial lobby, her cheap polyester waitress uniform stained with coffee. "Waitress, my glass is empty," Sophia snapped, not even looking up from her phone. Sophia, the city's most feared socialite, sat with her legs crossed, dripping in stolen diamonds. To her, the woman standing there was just a servant. To the world, Zariah was the elusive ghost owner of the Grand Imperial Hotel chain. Sophia smirked, dropping a single small coin into Zariah's trembling hand. "A tip for the gutter rat. Actually, I'm feeling generous. I'm hosting a gala here Saturday. You should come as my special guest." Zariah looked down at the coin, her face tight. Sophia's smile was poison. "Wear that uniform," Sophia whispered, leaning in. "It'll be hilarious watching you try to serve the elite while pretend to be one of us." Her friends erupted in laughter. Designer heels clicking away, they left Zariah standing in the shadows. Zariah gripped the coin until her knuckles turned white. In her head, she wasn't thinking about the mopping. She was thinking about the royal blue designer gown sitting in her penthouse, and the $5 million in sapphires Sophia would never be able to afford. 4 months before the champagne hit the floor, Zariah stood outside the towering glass facade of the Grand Imperial, looking up at the name her father had built with sweat and iron. To the world, she was the ghost. A name on a deed, a signature on a wire transfer, a woman who had spent a decade in London and Zurich perfecting the art of the deal. But the reports hitting her desk in Geneva were dark. Plummeting morale, missing millions, and whispers of a queen who ruled the lobby like a personal fiefdom. She didn't call a board meeting. She bought a pair of scuffed black shoes and a cheap synthetic headscarf. "Name?" the hiring manager barked, not looking up from a clipboard. "Zara." "Just Zara," she replied, her voice stripped of its executive silk. She was assigned to the lobby lounge, the most visible and vulnerable post in the building. It was there she met Edward, the general manager whose hair had turned silver in the 6 months since she'd last seen him. When she first approached him to clear a table, he almost dropped his tablet. His eyes went wide, his mouth opening to utter the word chairwoman, but Zariah caught his gaze with a look that could freeze a heartbeat. "The sugar is low at table 4, sir," she said pointedly. Later, in the darkness of the linen closet, Edward's hands shook. "Zariah, this is dangerous. Sophia. She isn't just a socialite. Her husband's people use the basement suites. They don't just stay here, they own the staff." "They don't own me, Edward," she whispered, her eyes glowing in the dim light. "And by the time I'm done, they won't even own their own cars." Over the next few weeks, Zariah became a shadow. She learned that the Mafia Queen Sophia wasn't just a bully, she was the conduit. Sophia would arrive with gift bags that never left the hotel, and high-stakes charity meetings where the only thing being donated was laundered cash through the hotel's inflated catering invoices. Zariah watched as Sophia intentionally tripped a young bellboy just to see him stumble, her laughter echoing through the marble halls. Zariah took it all in, every insult, every illegal transfer, every bruised ego of her staff. She was no longer just a billionaire doing due diligence. She was a sovereign watching her kingdom burn from the inside, waiting for the perfect moment to strike the match. The tension in the Grand Imperial became a living thing, a cold draft that followed Zariah through the gold-leafed corridors. Every day spent in the polyester uniform was a gamble, a thin veil between her mission and a violent exposure. The first crack in the mask appeared during a private luncheon in the Diamond Suite. As Zariah leaned in to refresh Sophia's mineral water, the cuff of her cheap uniform snagged, revealing the edge of her Patek Philippe, a custom timepiece worth more than the luxury sedan Sophia had arrived in. Sophia's predatory eyes narrowed, her gaze locking onto the shimmering platinum. "Wait," Sophia commanded, her voice a sharp blade. She reached out, her manicured fingers hovering inches from Zariah's wrist. "That watch. Where does a gutter rat get a piece like that?" Zariah didn't flinch. With the practiced grace of a seasoned operative, she tucked her hand behind her back, dropping a heavy silver tray on the carpet with a strategic clatter. The distraction worked. Sophia recoiled from the noise, her face twisting in disgust. "It's a knockoff, ma'am," Zariah lied, her voice flat and subservient. "A gift from a cousin in the city markets. It doesn't even keep the right time." Sophia sneered, the moment of suspicion passing as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by her usual boredom. Minutes later, in the secluded north hallway, disaster nearly struck again. Edward turned the corner, his mind clearly occupied by the mounting evidence of the mafia's presence. Seeing Zariah, his instinct took over. His spine straightened, and he began the deep, respectful bow reserved only for the chairwoman. "Madam, the reports?" he began, his voice echoing in the marble hall. Zariah lunged forward, catching him by the elbows and pulling him upright with a strength that startled him. "The trash in the service elevator, Edward. It needs to be cleared immediately," she hissed, her eyes darting to the security camera at the end of the hall. Edward froze, the color draining from his face as he realized his error. He stammered an apology and hurried away, leaving Zariah's heart hammering against her ribs. The stakes reached a breaking point that night. While cleaning the accounting manager's office, Zariah discovered a hidden ledger tucked behind a stack of legitimate invoices. It wasn't just small-time theft, it was a systematic bleed. Millions were being funneled through the hotel's renovation fund directly into Sophia's offshore accounts. Her hotel wasn't just a business anymore, it was the mafia's personal ATM. Zariah photographed the pages, her hands steady but her resolve turning to ice. The investigation was over. The war had begun. The penthouse of the Grand Imperial felt like a fortress above a city that had no idea it was about to witness a revolution. Zariah stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the distant lights of the skyline reflecting in her eyes, while the polyester waitress uniform lay discarded on the velvet sofa like a molted skin. Edward stood by the mahogany desk, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the woman who had spent months in the dirt reclaim her stature. "The security detail is briefed, madam," Edward said, his voice low and steady. "But Sophia's husband has men in every corridor. If this goes wrong, the police won't be fast enough to protect you." Zariah turned, her silhouette framed by the glowing metropolis. She wasn't the tired waitress he had seen mopping spills anymore. She was the architect of the building they stood in. "They aren't just guests in my hotel, Edward. They are parasites in my home." She walked toward a garment bag hanging from the door, her fingers tracing the outline of the fabric within. "Sophia thinks she invited a victim to her table. She thinks power is something you wear like a loud diamond." Edward looked at the ledger Zariah had recovered, the evidence of millions funneled into mafia accounts. "The risk is immense. You are putting the Bennett legacy on the line for a public spectacle." "I'm putting it on the line for justice," Zariah countered, her voice dropping into a register of cold, absolute authority. "I don't just own the hotel, Edward. I own the city." She unzipped the bag, revealing the royal blue designer gown that shimmered like a midnight ocean under the chandeliers. Beside it sat a velvet case containing $5 million in sapphires, stones that didn't just sparkle, they commanded respect. Zariah wasn't doing this for the applause or the ego. She was doing it to prove that the invisible workers she had stood beside for 4 months were seen by the only person who mattered. She was the chairwoman, and it was time to clean the house from the top down. "Tomorrow night," she whispered, looking at her reflection, "the Mafia Queen learns that the highest floor is the longest fall." The Grand Imperial Ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and predatory smiles, a gold-leafed arena where the city's elite gathered to celebrate their own reflection. Sophia stood at the center of it all, draped in crimson, her laughter cutting through the sound of the string quartet like a jagged blade. She kept glancing toward the service entrance, her eyes bright with the anticipation of her social experiment, waiting for the bedraggled waitress to stumble in and provide the night's cruelest entertainment. But when the heavy oak doors finally swung open, the music didn't just falter, it died. Zariah didn't walk into the room, she took possession of it. The royal blue silk of her gown moved like deep water, catching the light of 1,000 crystal prisms, while the sapphires at her throat glowed with a cold, ancient fire. Every head in the room turned, drawn by an aura of authority that no amount of stolen mafia money could ever buy. The invisible girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who looked as though she had carved the very pillars of the hotel with her own hands. Sophia's champagne glass tilted in her hand, the liquid spilling unnoticed onto her designer heels. Her face went through a sickening transformation, from confusion to recognition to a white-hot, trembling rage. "You," she breathed, her voice a jagged hiss that carried through the sudden silence. "How dare you? You thieving little rat." Sophia surged forward, her heels clicking like gunfire on the marble. "You stole that dress. You stole those jewels," she screamed, her composure shattering into 1,000 ugly pieces. She turned to the perimeter of the room, where the heavy-set security team stood like statues. "Guards, arrest her. Drag this servant out of my sight and throw her in the gutter where she belongs." The guests held their breath, expecting a violent struggle. The security team moved as one, their boots thundering against the floor as they closed the distance. Sophia smirked, her ego inflating with the prospect of Zariah's public ruin. But as the guards reached the center of the floor, they didn't reach for Zariah's arms. Instead they stopped. They turned their backs to Zariah, forming a protective, impenetrable phalanx between her and the Mafia Queen. Their heads bowed in perfect military synchronization. Edward stepped out from the shadows of the mezzanine, his voice steady, resonant, and carrying the weight of a final judgment. It wasn't the voice of a nervous manager, it was the voice of a man finally revealing the truth. "Gentlemen," Edward announced, his gaze fixed coldly on Sophia's crumbling face. "Lower your voices. You are in the presence of the chairwoman. You are in the presence of the owner." The only sound that followed was the crystal glass slipping from Sophia's fingers and shattering against the floor, a hollow, final echo of a reign that had just ended. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a heavy shroud that suffocated Sophia's dying screams of protest. As the realization of Zariah's true identity settled over the room like a cold winter fog, the Mafia Queen's husband's men, the very shadows that had once haunted the service corridors, remained frozen, paralyzed by the sight of their own security detail standing in total allegiance to the woman in blue. Zariah didn't look at the crowd. She kept her eyes locked on Sophia, whose face had drained of color until she looked like a ghost haunting her own failed party. "Respect is not a suggestion in this hotel, Sophia," Zariah said, her voice a calm, low vibration that commanded every ear in the hall. "It is the only currency we accept. And your account is empty." At a sharp nod from Edward, the guards who Sophia had tried to weaponize stepped forward. They didn't use force, but their presence was an immovable wall as they gripped Sophia's arms and began the long, public walk toward the exit. She was no longer a queen, she was a trespasser being purged from a temple. As she passed the service staff, the waiters and maids she had called furniture, they stood tall, their eyes following her out with a quiet, newfound dignity. Zariah ascended the podium, the royal blue silk of her gown sweeping across the stage like the tide reclaiming the shore. She adjusted the microphone, her gaze sweeping over the elite guests and the trembling supervisors who had enabled the embezzlement. "Effective immediately," she announced, "the management of this flagship is dissolved. Every supervisor who turned a blind eye to theft and abuse is terminated without severance." A collective gasp rippled through the room, but Zariah continued, her voice turning from iron to silk as she looked toward the back of the room where the kitchen staff stood. "To the staff who kept this hotel running while being treated as invisible, your wages are doubled and your voices will now be the loudest in this building." She reached into the folds of her gown and pulled out the single small coin Sophia had thrown at her days ago. She placed it on the podium with a sharp clink. "The era of the Grand Imperial being a playground for the cruel is over," she declared. "We are open for business, but only for those who understand that the person serving your wine is worth more than the vintage in the glass." As Zariah stepped down, she didn't return to the VIP table. She walked straight to the young waitress she had worked beside in the trenches, took a tray from her hands, and offered a simple, genuine smile. The billionaire had returned to her throne, but the waitress would never be invisible again. Comment below if this story inspired you. Smash that like button and subscribe to Best Tales for more stories proving that dignity exists independent of social position and true worth can never be hidden. See you in the next one.